Welcome to the North Press Town Hall. I'm your host, Olade Shiambola. I know you've missed me. It's been a couple weeks, but I'm here. I'm back. I'm here with the community. We're going to talk about reparations. We're going to talk about Black love, Black healing. We've been talking about unity and uniting across identities. And we're just learning from each other. And we want to hear from you guys. You know, what do you want to see for Black unity, for Black liberation? What steps do you believe we should take? How should reparations look? I want to talk about some updates in the community before we start. This past, what was it, Thursday was Nigerian Independence Day, and that hit a lot of nerves. It's a lot of celebration, and it's always a moment to give thanks. Like, okay, 60 years ago we said goodbye supposedly to the British. But the reality is there's so much wrong. There's so many things that are even worse today in Nigeria than when we were colonized. And that's because we really never ended the colonization. And I was really excited to see some writings from really important thinkers in Nigeria, especially in the entrepreneurship space. So shout out to Seni Suleiman. Shout out to Inya Boyeji. Like, I'm really excited to dialogue. I'm going to have them on very soon in November to talk about their articles and just really the dream that they have for Nigeria. Inya Boyeji was featured on the cover of Forbes Africa, and he said Nigeria can be the most, prosperous Black nation on earth, something like that. And I'm just so ready. I'm so ready for it. I'm so tired of asking for permission. I'm just ready to take our freedom. So I'm excited to see what's going to come of all of these dialogues and all of this community building. We want you to be a part of what we're doing. So join the conversation. I just realized that we're not live on Facebook, which is not what it's supposed to be. So I'm going to add the Facebook stream. So yes, amazing things happening in the diaspora. And I also want to shout out, there was a huge event earlier this week, the African Academic Diaspora Virtual Homecoming. And this was an initiative of the Ghanaian President's Office. There's an organization of African graduate schools, just so many are African universities, so much collaboration happening. Cornel West spoke at this event. At least he was on the slate. I didn't get to go, but I did share it with as many people as I could. They had Cornel West, they had the president of Ghana, they had Ambassador Chiambori Kwa, who has been on fire for African liberation. Everybody has their conflicts and their loyalties, but just really excited for all of the collaboration that's happening. Vote Like a Boss, Tiffany Norwood and her Vote Like a Boss tribe had an amazing event this past week. So go check it out. All of these details are on our NordPress site. If you go and look for the Chronicle, it's the third from the last article published. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on my faves for this town hall number 3. This is going to be the last one in this format. We want to switch it up a little bit and move into a larger conversation. We want to give ourselves some more time to really shift and deepen the conversation. Bring a broader speaker base in, and also get a bit more specific on the things that we want to talk about. I really want to talk about Black religion. Should we be Christian? Should we use traditional systems? Should we be Muslim? Well, what's the history? There's so many little things that we need to dive into, and to get the thinkers in the room who really know the history and can debate it. I'm really excited to make that happen. So first of all, I'm going to bring on Shane Lloyd. Shane, I met while I was at Yale. We worked at the Afro-American Cultural Center together. Let me bring you on while I'm introing you. So I don't want to read too much in detail, but Shane is like that voice. Like, if I'm ever on Instagram, I need some fire for white people. I know that Shane is like putting the fire up. Like, he does not mince words. He's always talking about race and class. Welcome, Shane.
Hi, everybody.
You always just saying the most like eloquent and fierce things to white people as far as just, what racism is and what classism and sexism and ageism, all of these isms. And I think you're just so powerful in the way that you communicate, like, where we are, what state we're in, and the role that people need to play. So welcome, and tell the people about your cultural background a little bit.
Sure. So hi everyone, my name is Shane. I'm very delighted to be on this. Lolade, thank you for inviting me. As far as my cultural background, I was born in the United States to two awesome parents that hailed from the Caribbean, and they are from the sister islands of St. Kitts and Nevis, primarily Nevis being 36 square miles and having about 10,000 people. So that is the sort of heritage I claim in my Blackness.
And you grew up in Long Island?
Yes, Long Island, New York, which I would like to acknowledge also shares the same landmass as Queens and Brooklyn, because there are many Brooklynites or sort of city types in New York who would otherwise deny me the access that I so rightfully deserve to being a true blue New Yorker just because I'm not from the city.
We love you. I claim New York. I claim Brooklyn. Nobody can take Brooklyn from me, so I claim you for the city. Nobody else will. Okay. So welcome, Shane. And you went to Brown. Did your undergrad? Your master's?
That's cool. Yeah, I got master's in public health. Houston University in Boston, and studied behavioral neuroscience. A whole other conversation.
Wow, that's a whole other episode.
Yes,
I want to hear all about that. Yeah, so Shane was holding it down at the Afro American Cultural Center, which is so special to me because that was my haven while I was at the university. That was the one safe place on campus that I just knew like I would be welcome no matter what. So thank you for all that you put into the Afro American Cultural Center, Shane. And I'm welcoming Uzomaka, the Oracle. You guys have met, but I'm gonna let you introduce yourself one more time for anybody who's watching us for the first time. I know your internet is not super clear.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Looked like my mic was muted. Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm Uzomaka. They call me Uzomaka the Oracle, to add some spiritual and metaphysical viewpoints to these wonderful, wonderful conversations. So thank you, Lolade, for having me on. I'm excited to what we are going to talk about today. A little bit about myself. I'm Nigerian. Yep, from my parents born in Nigeria. I was born in Nigeria. We came over here, and we have my younger siblings, and here we are today.
Welcome. And Jean-Louis Renaissance.
What's up, everybody?
Speak a little French for the people. Let us feel international.
What are you
Speak some French and some Greek.
Some Creole.
French and Greek and Creole. Speak some Creole. Let's hear something in Creole.
Like I said, not move late.
No, that's beautiful. Yes. That's what everybody says. That's what everybody says. It's like I said, give us something juicier.
I mean, one of the things that we can always kind of learn is a little quick introduction. I mean, bonjour, comment est, that's just hello, and how are you?
See?
And then, you can respond with, I'm fine, which it would be muy bien. Try that one out. Muy bien.
That's beautiful. Thank you for giving us that little tidbit. Welcome, Jean-Louis. For anyone who's watching this for the first time, Jean-Louis and I are back at Yale, and he studied ethics. Talk about yourself a bit, what you're doing now, what you want to do in the future.
Yeah. So I studied ethics at Yale and transitioned into more sort of hit on the grounds type of work regarding social welfare and social welfare policy. And now I'm studying at Columbia, finishing up this last year. And my focus there is social welfare policy, and really thinking about what I can do within government in this next year or two if I don't start law school. So we'll see. But super excited about just, November. Hopefully folks can go out and vote. Hopefully we have a new transition. And yeah, I'm super, super excited about November.
All right. Prayers up. You're the first person I heard say was excited. That's comforting. I'm like, somebody's looking forward to November. I thought everybody else was dreading it. So
I mean, you can't really. I mean, we got Obama's former sidekick, and we got an AKA running. You know what I mean, for the White House. This is as good as we're gonna get. You know what I mean, from what we have now. So I'm not complaining.
This is pure. This is like Idiocracy. Any of you guys seen Idiocracy? This is pure. Have any of you guys seen the movie? Oh my goodness! Please watch it. It's now considered. It's now a documentary. This is a mess.
Oh snap! Tell us about Idiocracy really quickly.
Idiocracy is about this guy who works in the military. They do some kind of secret, what do you call it, program with him, and like they get like a prostitute. He's the most average person on the earth, and then they get this prostitute woman, and they put them in a sleeping chamber. They're supposed to wake up. They forget about it. They wake up like 200 years later. It's like year 2000 and whatever. And it's just a hot mess. It's just a hot mess. The president is a mess. Nobody's drinking water. Everybody's just sitting, sipping on stuff, yelling at the TV. It's just a hot mess. But then it came out like early 2000. And even then we're like, okay, this is a documentary. But now it's really a documentary. So y'all check it out.
That is scary. But people we've been hearing that. People have been predicting this for a long time, this state of America. And, for us to go into reparations, and I'm glad that we're talking about the election now, because ultimately, this is an incredible moment. It's a really sensitive moment for Black folk as well, right? So like whatever happens in the US, if it gets worse than it already is, then we're going to see major repercussions for folk all over the world, especially poor people, right? And most of those people, a lot of those poor people are going to be Black, right? And so let's talk a little bit. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but as we transition into this idea of reparations and, healing Black trauma, how are you guys feeling about the election? What are you envisioning? What are you hoping to see?
That's a big, big, big question. So I think we have to think about a couple things. First is what are our reference points? So if we're thinking about this present administration and how we're sort of on a spiral towards fascism and what sort of the other party offers as a comparison point, there is a great deal of hope and opportunity. But if we think of, for example, Ibram Kendi's work around how just as much as there can be sort of anti-racist advancement can be a parallel track of racist advancement, we might just see sort of business as usual, just in a less virulent form. So when we even think about the concept of reparations across sort of Democratic or Republican administrations, that has always been sort of an open question that nobody has sort of wanted to dive into answering. And then, which invites us to think about, well, why are they avoiding it? Well, we have ideas. But then also, what sort of historical references are people sort of lacking to understand fully why reparations are even owed in the first place, and how even when we think about anti-discrimination laws, equal rights, equal opportunity, many people claiming that they're not racist or don't intend to be racist in their impact, that despite all that rigmarole, people are still not understanding from a sort of socio-historical perspective, we are owed, and there is a sort of dollar amount to that owing, and it's not just some amorphous concept.
Wow. Thank you for that, Shane. Uzo or John Louis, you guys have anything to add, or how you feeling about the election generally?
I'm cooling. It's gonna be here. Everybody vote. I'm just like this, and just sitting back. I have my popcorn and see what happens. Making my roots. I don't want to say like escape route, but it's time to divest a little bit for myself.
I hear that. So we said that we were going to talk about a tribunal. I want you guys to talk about what healing is. When we shared the first episode with one of our friends, Ola, he said, what is, he hears Black folk talk about healing all the time, but what is that? Like, what does healing actually mean? And so for me, I have to take it to reparations, because until you do that, you're not doing anything really. But we've been talking a lot about like individual experiences and our challenges, and coming into a united front, coming into some sort of united body, and understanding what Blackness can be universally, while giving everyone with a specific ethnic identity that ownership of that space. Right? The ability to sort of be who you are and claim whatever Black ethnicity you want to claim, but still understand like I'm part of a larger race of people. and we are all united, if by nothing else, the fact that so many people have been trying to take and take from us and decimate us for so long, and if we can't agree to at least end that, then what is the point of really anything? So what does healing look like for you guys? With all of this work, it has become clear to me. I've been doing a lot of inner work and a lot of this outer work with Noir Labs, and it has become clear to me that my inner healing is the same as what needs to happen for Black folk, right? I'm going through a particular path based on my ancestral lineage and the things that I have, been exposed to and traumatized by. And so I recognize that path might be slightly different from person to person, but there are definitely some universalities in that. And so I would love for us to talk a little bit about what healing looks like for you guys individually, how you see that sort of paralleling with the collective, and what is the macro level of Black healing?
I'm glad you bring up healing. Healing is very important. And like you said, is really, the inner work, because if we do the inner work, then the outer work, it shows itself in the outer frame, And so I think as a collective, Lodade, like you're saying, to really dive in there, and what it looks like, I feel, is first, even just the awareness of inner healing. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of us don't even know that we need that healing, and that it continues. It may start here, but it probably continues to you die, and beyond. And so first, just that healing. Like, if we look even at our media or anything that's teaching us or our children, there is nothing that stops and says, hey, I might need to do some inner work.
Right.
So I think that's like the first thing, like, hey, like, this is important. It would be lovely if it starts young, but from wherever anybody is, just kind of looking, seeing the areas that are uncomfortable, seeing the areas that's uncomfortable within, looking without the people. What are the people reflecting to us? And instead of having so much of like a outward kind of response to them, to take that in and say, hey, what is this mirroring to me? You know what I mean? If this person is getting my last nerve, this family member, a friend, work person, what does this say? What is this saying about me? If they're critical, it probably means there's some place within me that I'm critical. If they're judgmental, it's probably some place within me. And being able to kind of like do that on a big scale, individually, but also for little everyday things, and I think that's the detail that sometimes we miss, that it's every day.
That's powerful. That would be Shane.
Yeah, well, what comes to mind for me is this sort of concept of the mirror and the microscope, where are the opportunities for me to sort of like think about myself and what I'm seeing in my own reflection and sort of critically engage that. But then also with the microscope, where am I engaging in this sort of sense of deep exploration, not just of myself, but also my relationships with my loved ones, friends, and sort of people proximate to me, but then also thinking about how I relate to other social groups. And then how do we also think about, particularly to the point around sort of reparations, that also invites us to really consider what is owed across generations. Like, what is a debt that may not be settled in my generation, but I need to till the soil to ensure that it's settled for someone else's generation. So that's why I tend to be sort of pretty vocal, both in sort of challenging sort of like dominant systems of power, particularly sort of like around race dynamics, gender, sort of race and class as well. But then also thinking about, I also occupy spaces of dominance as well. So I do also have to think about, in my own healing, how do I heal my own injuries while also acknowledging that some of the ways that I might relate to people, whether consciously or unconsciously, are also situated in an abusive dynamic. So that means that some of what I might actually construe as injury is actually really veiled entitlement. So part of that healing process is really engaging in sort of, in some respects, a course correction of our lenses so that we're seeing things clearly and not running around with the stigmatism, sort of being entitled to either sort of rights or comforts that also infringe on people who share community with me and share and support me as well.
I want you to say a little bit more about veiled entitlement and, and the spaces of dominance that you feel that you occupy.
Oh, yeah. So big thing is thinking about just my maleness. I grew up in a traditional Caribbean household. I had a lot of freedom of movement. I had a lot of sort of, boys will be boys, or, you have you need to aspire to XYZ. And those are not, I have a twin sister. The kinds of conversations that my twin sister and I had around sort of aspirations, career opportunities, the ability to sort of do what we want or to push the envelope without penalty are not the same at all. And it's not to say that my parents are like aiming to be explicitly sexist, as much as they are also products of the culture that they inherited and then transmitted to us, which was also reinforced by many of the groups that we walked into, so, or existed in rather. So I think that for me, it's also important for me to consider that sort of gender dominance that most Black men, whether raised in the United States or in the Caribbean or on the continent or elsewhere, have sort of socialized to acquire, but then also thinking about class dominance. When we think of the opportunities that our parents aim to provide to us, it's like, how are you able to provide for your family? How are you able to sort of make a sort of steady income, or just to sort of like have more than enough? Like, class socialization is particularly powerful because it's assumed to be something that can change. And I was very much raised in, like, the neighborhood I was raised in Long Island is a very middle class neighborhood. I have a college degree. I also moved through an elite institution, both as a student and as someone who is a staff member. So we also have to acknowledge just like the sheer power of like class dominance, in the sense that we might feel entitled to be the sort of spokesperson, the vocal party, the sort of representation of our community because we have this training, this education, and even how people talk about our credentials, where people might say, oh, they also have a degree from an elite institution. It's like, how interesting that we critique these institutions for being elitist and racist and exclusive, while also using them as sort of bully pulpits, so to speak, to say that we deserve a particular platform. So that's one way which I think that we have to be sort of interrogating sort of tools of access, but tools that also extend reach of dominance. So
that's
just
powerful. Okay, take us to school. All right, JL, let me hear from you. What's healing look like? You're muted, mama or son. Father.
Yeah, no, I was trying to figure out the mic. But this is like one of the things that will always be remembered of this virtual world, the muting of mics. We should have had that in our recent debate.
That was not a presidential debate. That was a whole other thing. Yeah.
You're right. Well, come on now.
You're not even giving them 10 seconds on it. Talk about something else.
No. But seriously, I think what Uzo and Shane has pointed out and really just helped folks see is that, like, healing is contextual, right? In the context in which you find yourself in, healing is going to look very, very particular and different. I think for me personally, I think on an individual micro level, healing for me doesn't look like reparations in the traditional sense, but it looks like, again, I think we talked about this a few live sessions back, but it looks like spaces without discrimination. To be frank, like, I know someone can give me $100 million today and go out into the world and tell me to invest. But I also know that every space I'll occupy with my $100 million, I will be viewed a certain way because I'm a Black man, a Black individual with $100 million, right? And so I look at it in the same way, with someone with no money, right? And just ideas, right? They go into a bank and they have brilliant ideas, but the way in which they get, assessed or even proffered certain loans with certain interest rates is completely different than someone who is non-Black with, again, brilliant ideas. And you hear it all the time. Folks who had nothing to their name and they walked in and someone gave them a chance, and you kind of scratch your head on, like, well, why did they give you a chance versus, the brother or the sister or the trans or the queer individual who had just the same idea, if not more, right? So for me, healing, right, is the process of becoming healthy again, right? And for me, all the pains that I've experienced have been pains of limitation and discrimination. And so what healing might look like for me will be spaces of, free of discrimination of all sorts. Because I also have I've also learned that I've had certain learning disabilities, and I've also seen how things in my lifetime have limited me, that I know if in an ideal world I otherwise wouldn't have.
So can you talk a little bit more about limitations, the limitations that you've come against?
Oh, I mean, the obvious one is the limitation of education, right, and standardized testing. When I was growing up, I grew up one of 13, right? So I had 12 brothers and sisters. And I grew up in an era, and I think this era is still present with us today, where counseling, psychological help, therapy was sort of stigmatized or shunned upon, especially within the, I would argue, African Haitian diaspora community. It's not something you go to, you know what I mean? It's not something for your day-to-day normal person, right? It's for those who are quote unquote crazy, right? Or for students who need individual education plans, which in my case I actually needed. Right? So I went through essentially first grade all the way through graduating to Yale to only find out in my time at Columbia that I had a learning disorder.
Wow.
And now figuring out after neuropsych evaluation of all the coping mechanisms I actually developed that were never actually normal. But the standardized testings, you know what I mean, or a test, given what its what its normative projects, assumptions, educational frameworks, language that it uses, already put me in boxes that I had to feel like I needed to do more to overcome. But my doing more was actually doing the most without any help. So, I mean, educational limits, I can go financial limits. I mean, I said this before, and I think if I ever run for politics, it'll be right, you know what I mean, about Jean-Louis, right on my front page. But, you know, I grew up also in a home where my father made $15,000 a year. I mean, he had absorbed toxic masculinity to the max in such a way that he refused to let my mom go off and work because he believed that if she had gone off and worked, she would eventually find enough independence to leave him because he was a lecher. He cheated on my mom several times. And you know what I mean? That was what I was growing up with, right? So the lack of resources on one end, right? Or the scarcity of resources on one end, right? Individual, you know, psychological issues that I needed to address that, you know, my folks, given the society and culture that we were in, you know, couldn't even fathom to address or, you know, or approach. And then also my own personal desires and dreams to want to be whatever in the world, right? So there were always limitations on me. But I think more importantly, when I think about our talk about reparations, you know, and our talk about even the larger Black community on a micro level, I would still argue that that's one aspect of healing for the Black community to be not given, but to, I don't even know how to frame it without even sounding, you know, paternalistic, but just bear with me. To be allowed a space in which we are not discriminated against. I think that's first and foremost, because even if you gave us a lifetime of therapy, I mean, anybody in public health, in medicine, in psychology, sociology knows that even if you gave Black people generational access to therapy, it wouldn't negate the fact that many therapists, many psychologically trained individuals come in with biases about Black people, Black bodies, Black women, Black men, Black trans, Black queer, Black, you know what I mean? Black people.
I have a question about your Spaces Without Discrimination. I'm really curious if, you know, and thank you for everything that you shared, because that was all very powerful and necessary. I'm curious if what those spaces look like for you, right? Do you believe that it's possible to create Black-only spaces that can thrive? Do you think that, do you desire more so the opportunity to access white spaces and not be discriminated against? What do you think is maybe even the shorter term solution? That's for you, JL.
I mean, that's an open question. I mean, I opened it up, but that's open also to Shane and Uzo.
So in terms of like, would it be all Black spaces or white spaces or mixed spaces where white people mind their business? Or
I'm just curious what if you guys hear a space without discrimination, like what does that mean? What does that look like? What does that feel like in the ideal world?
In the ideal world, for me, it will be people of color who are professionals in everything that we need. So Jean-Louis, thank you for sharing, because you really hit so many points. I mean, this thing is like, we could talk about this every day for 8 hours for 20 years and still and still probably have areas to touch. It's so deep, it's so much. But to be, like you said, you go to the bank, like, can we get, so it'll be like needing money, going to a bank that's run by people like me who understand where I'm coming from, who talk my language, who could give me what I need. Going to the doctor, somebody I need speaks my language, knows what I need. It's not just like yada yada. You know what I mean? Like all the different things, even like law enforcement, you know what I mean? Somebody who you can call, you're safe, they can have a conversation, they understand the dynamics, they, et cetera, et cetera. You go to Starbucks, same thing. Nobody's looking at you sideways, so yeah, really having these spaces where it's professionals that look like us and that understand what we're going through, you know what I mean? And without the other isms, misogyny, classism, all that other stuff. But at least starting from there, that'd be nice.
Wow. Okay, what about you, Shane?
Yeah, so I think about this in a few ways, because one, sort of how are we defining the space and sort of setting the context for it, but then also how are we defining discrimination? Because some of the ways that I even think about racism is that race is a social marker with real meaningful consequences when we think about the systems in which race is situated. But race could also just be like, imagine a world where race is like left-handedness, something that is a difference, but not a sort of difference that's connected with sort of loss of life, loss of opportunity, loss of like ability to sort of wield power and sort of define one's reality and outcomes. So part of when I think of sort of these spaces is how are we sort of setting the context for how these spaces exist, because I don't think that there's any space that will exist without a social hierarchy. I just don't think social hierarchies have to be nearly as virulent. And I also don't think that social hierarchies have to be ones in which the power differentials are so severe that people can't get feedback around their impact. Because I do think that coming from different sort of diasporic cultures, for example, we are going to end up running into each other and feeling some kind of injury, not because of a space of invidiousness, like I think of you as inferior or superior, as much as, oh, I just did not realize that you meant it that way. And I need to be curious about we both need to be curious about our sort of mutual lenses, so to speak, to understand how we can sort of be in community with one another and then build community with one another, which will naturally take some time for us to get to know each other. Different than sort of the circumstances we exist in today, in the sense of we are sort of embedded within a system that's already sort of like flowing and running, and we're trying to figure out how to disrupt a current that is both historically mediated and sort of real and present, while also sort of structuring spaces that allow us both repair, refuge, and community, which is why I really valued a space like the Afro-American Cultural Center, because it was a sort of awesome gathering place. It was not perfect, but it was a gathering place where we could actually really be in conversation with one another around how we're actually co-creating a community in an institution that is historically white, historically exclusive, and hyper elitist. So to be able to do that under those kinds of conditions really also situates, it's perilous on one end, but then also really exciting that we could actually create spaces like that in what's otherwise an implicitly or explicitly hostile space.
Wow, I love that you said that. Repair, you talked about repair a lot. And so, in doing this work and building something like Nora Labs, which is literally for Black people, and navigating a space like Yale and trying to get support and resources for it, was I even able to say, like, this is just for Black people, knowing that because whatever we do as Black folk will attract other people naturally, because that's who we are. We are magnetic for everybody else, right? They're gonna come to our shit. And that's okay, because we're not trying to, be, we're not trying to sort of perpetuate those same systems of discrimination, right? It's more so like the priority is to create a space for Black folks. So when we talk, when we have these dialogues, and when I scroll my socials, I just see so much energy being directed at white people, what white people are doing, what they're saying, how they're feeling, how they're not treating us. And it's so rare that I see that same energy being directed towards us, right? Being focused on what are we doing? How can we do, what do we need for each other, for ourselves, by ourselves, you know? And for me, it's not about, exclusion. It's really just the opportunity for repair. Like, how do you repair something if it continues to be jabbed, right? Because if we're in these spaces, we call them microaggressions, even though they're not micro, right? But because people don't understand what we need and who we are, they're going to express, hostility directly or indirectly, right? And so instead of focusing on them, I would just love to see every Black person, just focusing on us, right? How do we craft these spaces to repair so that when we do engage with the outside world, it's from a place of, self-knowledge, self-mastery, self-love, self-respect, Black love, right? When we come to these people from a perspective of, we're the original people and you're lucky that we let you live, as opposed to like, please, can I have a seat, at the table, we're going to experience a very different sort of reaction from those people.
Yeah, I think what's really key too is that, right, that I think, Shane implicitly pointed out that distinction between, society, given the social contracts that we have, right? I mean, obviously this is assuming a lot of Western philosophy, blah, 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 whatever, right? Like, you're always going to have prejudice, right? Like these preconceived notions of people that aren't necessarily based on reason, but, come from whatever intuition that you source it from, right? But prejudice is different from discrimination, right? Because discrimination is really unjust prejudicial treatment, right? Like you're not unjust when you're a barista at Starbucks and somebody walks in the restaurant wanting coffee with an AK-47 in their hand. Like that, I mean, like you're right to be prejudiced in that sense, right? To have certain things that might happen given whatever society that you're in, but you are unjust and giving someone astonishingly high interest rates simply because they're Black and you think some way somehow they won't make the mortgage on time. You know what I mean? Like that's what I'm trying to get at. I don't want a space where there is no prejudice. I mean, and I don't even think that's possible. But I do want a space where there is no unjust prejudicial treatment.
Do you think it's possible?
Of course. Okay. I've walked into certain spaces where, let's just talk about it within our own community as well too, because I think that's important. I don't think white people are the only people who discriminate against ourselves, right? Like we know that, right? Like that's the difference between it. If you're from the Caribbean, you know what I'm talking about. Light-skinned Black folk and non-light-skinned Black folk. I mean, you know what I mean? Like colorism within our own communities. That's the unjust, prejudicial treatment that I'm talking about. We don't need, you know what I mean? Or for me to feel that I even have the opportunity to really heal, to really repair myself, what you were talking about, Lola, is to have those spaces where I can walk in a room and just because my sister is lighter skinned than me, my mom ain't gonna sit there and greet her first or acknowledge her being first for an hour or two before she acknowledges my little brown mocha self. You know what I mean? Like this is what I'm talking about. Like it's those little moments, right, that we experience, right? Now, obviously, I don't want to shift the onus or responsibility to change those things on Black people. But what I'm really trying to say is that like there are spaces of discrimination that we can contextualize, we can also name, but we can also expand our scope and understanding of it. It doesn't have to be narrow. It doesn't have to be bigoted. In many spaces that we found historically, those spaces of freedom or liberation have been sort of small. I mean, look, last point, but look at in the 1960s and 70s or 50s and 40s, a lot of the spaces of no discrimination were found in the church. But if you actually like read, memoirs and stories of like queer people, they didn't find refuge in the church. I mean, Bayard Rustin wrote speeches for Dr. Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like it's like these things, like, but he was queer and he couldn't be, fully, Bayard Rustin. So it's these type of things, like Martha P. Johnson, right? Like it wasn't like, their spaces of freedom weren't necessarily in the church, right? Or weren't necessarily in one building, right? So that's what I'm trying to say, is like, I think we can also expand our understanding of that. The scope doesn't have to be small.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking about a couple of the items that you just shared. So I think there's also one aspect that I want to make sure that we lift up too. When we think about healing, to your point, Lolade, around sort of there's inner work that we can do, but also within the dimension of a prayer, there's some forms of repair that can only happen in the context of my relationship between sort of individuals, but then also my relationship to community. Because oftentimes, sometimes we might get this sort of false notion that all of the repair can happen through sort of like some Zen inner state and sort of reflective meditation, which is just simply not true. Like some of the damage of relationship, like whether that's a relationship with sort of early caregivers or siblings or the like, can really only be healed in sort of relationships through our colleagues, the communities we call home, our chosen family. So how do we actually think about repair, not just on the sort of like one-on-one level, but also between each other? And thinking about what that transition looks like to move from a space that might be sort of injurious, prejudicial, and abusive to something that's more sort of collaborative, mutual, and sort of honoring of our sort of varied humanities. And then thinking about the other point that you shared, Jean-Louis, is I think there are a few directions that we need to play in. There is how do we sort of restore injuries of the past, but then how do we anticipate injuries that might emerge because there wasn't the space and opportunity to sort of explore how in the evolution of our movement building, some of the stuff that was best practice was actually more insidious than we had time to reckon with. So the example of sort of queer antagonism and the church, it's like racism was so powerful and virulent within the United States context that we all had to sort of be Black and beautiful together, but we couldn't be Black and different. And the assumption that when you move any number of differences, whether that's differences of class, of gender, of sexuality, of even faith orientation, actually, or even ethnic representation, that is inherently viewed as divisive versus like differences are just matters of fact. The system that sort of sets our framework determines how we relate to difference, because we could also see difference as the sort of site of our collective power, which is something that oftentimes came up in, for example, people who would move through the Afro-American Cultural Center with the prevailing sort of idea that, oh, this only cares about like African-Americanness, without ever considering that some of the people who painted the artwork that adorned the center were actually Ghanaian artists or African artists. Or the idea that when we think of the people who are sort of the quote unquote founders of the Afro-American Cultural Center, we interpret them to be African-American, but we've never actually investigated their lineage. For all we know, they could have been American. And just studying in the United States. So when we think about sort of even reparative spaces and even the concept of sort of reparations beyond the United States, that's where it becomes really imperative for us to really think of like, where are the examples of like Blackness transnational, and how do we get that information, not just through the history textbooks that we encounter in our educational settings, but also within the stories that are actually passed down. Like, for example, many people oftentimes do not sort of make the connection between the Haitian Revolution and sort of movements in the United States because they're seen as sort of like distinct historical entities, without considering that slavery was like a transnational set of sort of actors. So you had lots of bodies moving from different places, lots of goods moving to different places, and sort of money sort of propping up sort of powerful political people in lots of different places and spaces. Or the fact that Chicago was arguably found by a Haitian immigrant. So these are kind of narratives and stories that we're not really receiving often enough to understand our interconnectedness and really sort of realize that the past might actually be made more narrow than it actually is. And then the future could be a great deal more complex and easier to grapple with if we didn't set up these sort of superficial roadblocks and anticipating that, you know what, if someone looks at this video in 2042 and they're like, wow, Shane was really flashy on that point, I can't just take umbrage where like, I'm a preeminent scholar on blah, 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 blah. You can't creep me. You know what? I was actually working with the best information that I had at the time, and I'm actually really excited to be challenged and have my thinking evolve, even if it might be experiences being dragged through the coals, because the sort of movement building, these moments of solidarity and community, yes, we need that feel-good opportunity, and we also need some of that discomfort to really help us sort of see a little bit of the urgency, and also even operating, frankly, outside of feelings, because I think that sometimes when we're thinking about these healing spaces, we might be healed, but there's still like more that needs to be done. So thinking about how healing rituals can sometimes make us feel better, but make us neglect the ongoing work that needs to happen. So one example I think of is the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa, in the sense that that was a very, very powerful set of activities, but it did not redistribute wealth at all. It did not really fundamentally redistribute power. And a lot of people are talking about how that is a model that should be replicated. And I'm like, yes, I think we definitely need practices that sort of promote sort of reckoning, truth, investigation, examination, and ultimately sort of like stemming of hurt, while also still making sure that we drive change towards redistribution of power and resources. Because it's almost like when someone's murdered and then we either sort of grab a bag of Skittles or take pictures with hoodies or go on a 2-mile run. And it's like, those are important rituals that facilitate the healing process. But if 3 months later we're doing that for another person, then how are we making sure that our healing, right sizing what our healing can address while still sort of being very diligent in the work ahead? So that was like 3 million different things. So
all of them very necessary. And I'm so glad you brought up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. I want to share with viewers, because you guys saw, the scenario that I posed for this conversation, but and for those who are watching, you might have seen the description. But I just kind of want to read it a bit, because these are the questions and the dialogues that we need to really press forward with. It's not just, just going to be a one-time thing. We're going to keep talking about this. But I wrote that a tribunal has been called at the UN, bringing a case against the US, the UK, Belgium, France, and Arab countries for the infinite losses caused by genocide and their profit from it in African countries, the violence meted out against Black people living in the colonized countries over the last 400 years. The aim of the tribunal is to determine what events caused the greatest negative impact on African people and the damages they've caused, as well as to begin to calculate estimates for reparations. I love, that people are talking about using that model in South Africa elsewhere. And I totally agree that we need, those types of commissions and tribunals. But like you said, it has to be attached to action. It has to be attached to a plan, and I've talked about this on previous lives that we've done. I'm going to publish it probably this week. My blueprint, the blueprint that we're working from, the kind of ideas that we're working from at NOIR Labs, as far as what seems to need to happen for Black folks to be, to be liberated, right? It needs to be a full-on 100-year project, right? It's not something, but what you said about the history being highlighted and really demystifying history, because I totally agree with you that it's very likely to be narrow, right? We're always uncovering new information about, the diversity of Blackness and the ways in which we've collaborated, and this idea of us collaborating seeming so new and foreign, whereas it's what we've always done. I want to hear from you, Uzo. We have 9 minutes left. We're going to start to wrap up and schedule our next one. We need to do these weekly. I don't know. Somebody got to own it.
Oh, for real. Oh my goodness. This is just a lot, you know what I mean? And, it's important for us to process this, but it makes me just be like, like mothership, come on. And let's go, But there's a few things, like one, colonialism is one hell of a drug, and if we look at this like as assimilation, what are the malware? What is the viruses that's within our psyche, the way that we work as humans, the way that we work as Black people? And we really need to, I don't know how that happens, but there needs to be some kind of like awareness around sitting down. And I think we talked about in some other ones, and picking out those things, you know, and part of that is religion, because we talk about, you know, the black, you know, the black churches, and then being queer and not having the space, and it's probably a list of 5 million other things, and that's part of colonialism. That's part of, you know, that religion. You know, before all of this, what was happening for real, you know what I mean? Like, and so for us to really pick out some of those, it's like ticks, like pick them out, and identify them. Like, this is not us. Homophobia is not us. You know, this level of hatred is not us. This level of violence is not us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, colorism is not us. And to really unpack some of this stuff and to start to re-identify what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be a melanated being, you know? And I think we're going to have to take this, you know, higher, you know what I mean? To a different, you know, who said this? I don't know who said this, but somebody said that you can't solve your problems in the current, you know, with your current thought process. We really have to take this up a bit, you know what I mean? Because we were not going to be able to do what we want to do here in this system, in this matrix, you know? So we really got to, you know, develop a way, like, how do we really want to live? What are the things that we need? And how can we begin to make these things happen? And let me not say begin, because they're already there, but how do we shine more light to it? How do we make these things super duper priority? You know, and I think a big thing with that, it's like the collective economics, and we see that movement coming. We need to make that needs to be like the thing, you know, as hard as everybody went with boycotting Gucci, boycotting, you know, whoever else, we need to go hard on like, we got to do this whole, you know, collective, and not even just by Black, yes, by Black, but collective economics for real, you know, and really step it. We can't rearrange this. That's the problem.
Say more about the collective economics and what that could look like in some level of detail.
So, like, you know, we need resources to do this thing. Part of the power is in the resources. You know, white folks got the resources, you know what I mean? That's just what it is globally. And we can't get resources from asking them to reach into their pocket and give us something. I'm not talking about reparations. I believe reparations is important, but just in general, you know what I mean? We really have to create our own economic system. And the way to do that is to really have a strong collective consciousness, awareness, movement, whatever you want to call it, about collective economics, meaning these things that we do to be consciously buying from Black folks the best that we can, you know what I mean? And that to really be what do you call it? An intention. There we go, an intention. And for like people, and then for us to see, okay, what are the areas we can, you know, we can use more. Well, that goes into, I don't really want to go down that road, but yeah, what can we do? Where can we spend with each other and the best that, you know, that we can, and what are the ways that we can manufacture the best that we can, and how can we support those manufacturing companies? You know what I mean? So, for example, you know, people who's doing fashion now using Ankara, let's not use the Dutch wax. Maybe we need to go to Ghana and do their textiles. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of issues logistically with doing that. What can we do to, you know, encourage that? What can we do to help that, et cetera, et cetera? And I know these things are happening, but anyway, what is the best way to help our money flow amongst one another? And that's what's going to help to give us some leverage. But there's so many pieces to this thing. There's just so many pieces, but I think the plan, Lolade, I think what you said is really important, like the 100-year plan, because this is not something that hopefully can happen in 20 years, hopefully it can happen next week, but we really have to make a strategic long-term plan for something that we might not even see. I think, you know, Shane, you mentioned that too. We need to be okay with us not seeing it. Even our children not seeing it is maybe for our great-great-grandkids, and that's fine. And creating a system that's just outside of this. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. And they need, and I think one last thing in terms of reparations, I think that's going to be important too, because if they do cut a check, right? Let's say they cut $1 trillion check, right? What next? You know, what next? And to be able to now look at the plan that we have and to be able to to let that money free us for real, and not, because the thing is, they give us money, they do it all the time, they give you back your cash check, your tax refund, your stimulus check, and it goes right back in their hands. So if they're like, okay, let's go ahead, they've been talking about this, shut them up, let's write them this check, but let's create ways where this money comes right back to us. We have to be very, very conscious of that as well. Yeah, but it's happening. It's a new world. You know what I mean? This is crumbling, and I see it happening.
Yeah, the new world is being built all around us. Our doing our part.
Go
ahead. Yes.
I just wanted to name, though, because I know it was on the prompt. I do believe, though, that the transatlantic slave trade was the most impactful thing on the Black plight across the world, stemming from the 15th century to the 19th century.
Anybody else want to venture answer to that question? What are the things that reparations should, the events, the atrocities, the reparations, an agenda, a tribunal should prioritize?
I definitely think the slave trade, and then also their occupation in Africa, and they need to get the hell out, you know what I mean? And open up those seats.
Yeah, I think that I would definitely rank the transatlantic slave trade as sort of highly, while also pushing us to think about, we can not only think about acute events, but when we think about sort of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism and how sort of land rights, ownership, profit-making systems, and how that sort of implicates everybody across many sort of countries across the world. Or even thinking about how China is moving in to sort of become its own sort of imperial power, siphoning resources out of the continent. Like, we really have to think of both just sort of acute acts of sort of violence, but then also those systemic measures that are still extracting sort of livelihood and vitality out of the continent as sort of significant acts of injury. And unfortunately, it's oftentimes our line of sight will be like, the most heinous and sort of explicit acts of violence are the ones that command our attention. But it's like, when people are able to sort of kill us spiritually, or kill us slowly, or kill us in sort of very imperceivable ways, those are similarly as deleterious as sort of the acute acts of violence.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Ooh, chills. All right. You're all right. I totally agree with you. I wrote something yesterday, was thinking through, I think, Uzo, you were the one who talked about how Mansa Musa may have triggered, the beginning of slavery, right? They saw the wealth, the excessive wealth, and it became, it became a high priority. We got to go get this money, And so the way I look at the history of the white on black experience, is that it just brought us into a new era of being. I don't think there's really any discrete events. Of course, the slave trade, but just that progression of, we are going to take everything we can from these people and we're going to eliminate them as much as it is required in order to get the maximum profit. And that's just literally the era that we live in. And so racism, anti-Black violence, racial capitalism, it's a continuum of events and activities and policies and systems that makes it so that everywhere you look across the globe, we are at the lowest rung of the social ladder, and it's not ever by accident. So yeah, we in our lives, we're doing our part to really aggregate all the good stuff that's already happening, all the bright minds, the genius minds who are already thinking about these solutions, so that we can amplify our own voices. We don't need CNN. We don't need any, permission from non-Black entities to validate our positions and our voices. We really have to create our own language, our own platforms, our own voice in order to state what is true for us as, as individual representatives of our experiences, but as people who are passionate and deeply concerned about the plight of Black folk and committed to changing that permanently. So, for all of you guys watching, we appreciate you. I'm going to shout out our commenter, Salami, Ayodele. Thank you for being so loyal. We love you. If you watch this later, if you're watching, you haven't commented, drop us a comment. Let us know what you thought, what you'd like to see us talk about in future episodes. Look out for an email from me if you're on our mailing list. If you're not, get on it today. Look out for an email from me tomorrow. We're going to have our first Sunday dinner next Sunday. We want to know how everybody's feeling about the election, just how you're thinking about the future, just really reconnect and break bread and watch a couple movies. And lots more things coming through the pipe. Definitely check out the Chronicle, what Kirsten posted in the comments. We're going to continue to sort of chronicle events that are happening. Next week, we'll have a Black Genius cipher. I'll send more details about that in my email tomorrow. And then November, we're going to bring on some Harambeans. We're going to start a series with Harambeans telling their stories of how they are transforming the African continent. So thank you guys, everybody, for watching. Follow us on this page on Facebook, noirpress.org, on Instagram, Noirpress, Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube page. Stay connected. We love you. Eat your greens, take your vitamin C, all that good stuff. Stay healthy. Deuces.